When most people think about serial killers, they picture the household names: Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy. But here's the thing that should terrify you: those are just the ones who got famous, the ones who made headlines, the ones Hollywood turned into movies and documentaries. But hiding in the shadows of criminal history are killers whose names you've never heard, whose faces you wouldn't recognize, and whose crimes were so brutal, so calculated, so utterly inhuman that even seasoned investigators struggled to process what they were seeing. These aren't your typical serial killers. These are the forgotten monsters, the ones who slipped through the cracks of public memory but left behind trails of horror that would make your skin crawl. Tonight, we're diving into the darkest corners of criminal history to uncover 5 of the most evil serial killers you've probably never heard of. David Berkowitz, who terrorized New York with a reign of terror that went far beyond what the media ever reported. The Wednesday Strangler, whose methodical approach to murder turned an entire city into a hunting ground. Richard Speck, whose single night of violence shocked a nation. The Saw Killer of Hanover, whose workshop of horrors operated in plain sight for years. And Albert Fish, a monster so depraved that even other criminals refused to associate with him. What you're about to hear isn't just disturbing, it's a glimpse into the minds of killers who didn't just take lives, they destroyed them. These men didn't kill in moments of passion or rage. They planned, they hunted, they savored every moment of terror they inflicted. And the most chilling part? They were walking among us, looking like ordinary people, while carrying out acts that defy human comprehension. Let's start with a name that might sound familiar, but I guarantee the story you think you know is just the tip of the iceberg. David Berkowitz. Most people know him as the son of Sam, the man who terrorized New York City in the summer of 1977 with a .44 caliber revolver. But what the public never learned, what the media never reported, is that Berkowitz's killing spree was far more extensive, far more organized, and far more connected to a network of evil that stretched across multiple states. David Richard Berkowitz was born in 1953 in Brooklyn, New York. From the outside, his childhood looked normal enough. Adopted by a middle-class Jewish family, he grew up in the Bronx with parents who tried to give him every advantage. But something was wrong from the very beginning. Even as a young child, David displayed behavior that made adults uncomfortable. He was obsessed with fire, constantly setting small blazes in trash cans, abandoned lots, anywhere he could watch something burn. His adoptive mother would later tell investigators that she found him multiple times standing over small fires, not moving, not speaking, just watching the flames with an expression she described as pure fascination. By his teenage years, the warning signs were impossible to ignore. David was a loner who spent hours in his room, writing in journals that he kept locked away from his family. He had no friends, no girlfriends, no connections to anyone his age. Instead, he wandered the streets of the Bronx at night, sometimes for hours, just walking and watching. Neighbors would report seeing him standing motionless under streetlights, staring at apartment windows, studying the people inside like they were specimens in a laboratory. When he turned 18, David joined the army, and for a brief moment it seemed like structure might save him. He was stationed in South Korea, where he served as a sharpshooter. His commanding officers noted that he was an exceptional marksman, calm under pressure, and capable of hitting targets at distances that impressed even veteran soldiers. But they also noted something else. David seemed to enjoy the killing aspects of military training more than he should have. During combat exercises, while other soldiers treated it as necessary training, David treated it like a game. He would smile during target practice, especially when using human-shaped targets. After his discharge in 1974, David returned to New York, but he wasn't the same person who had left. Something had changed during his time in the military. He had learned to kill efficiently, quietly, and without hesitation. More importantly, he had learned that he enjoyed it. He moved into a small apartment in Yonkers and got a job as a security guard, a position that gave him access to buildings, keys, and most importantly, a reason to be out at night without attracting suspicion. The official story says that David Berkowitz's killing spree began on July 29, 1976, when he shot and killed Donna Loria and wounded Jody Valenti in the Bronx. But investigators who worked the case privately believe the real number of victims was much higher. There were similar shootings across New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut that bore Berkowitz's signature, but were never officially connected to him. Young couples shot at close range with a .44 caliber revolver, often while sitting in parked cars, often in locations that seemed random but were actually carefully chosen for their isolation and escape routes. What made Berkowitz different from other serial killers wasn't just his method, it was his psychology. He didn't kill in fits of rage or uncontrolled violence. Every murder was planned, calculated, and executed with military precision. He would spend weeks scouting locations, studying the patterns of potential victims, mapping out escape routes, and timing his attacks down to the minute. He kept detailed journals of his surveillance, noting the habits of dozens of people he was considering as targets. Police found these journals after his arrest, and they revealed a level of preparation that chilled even experienced homicide detectives. But here's where the story gets even darker. Berkowitz didn't work alone. During his confession, he made references to a network of people who shared his interests, people who helped him plan attacks, and even participated in some of the killings. He mentioned names, locations, and details about crimes that had never been solved. When investigators tried to follow up on these leads, they hit walls. Evidence disappeared, witnesses refused to talk, files went missing. It was as if someone with significant power was making sure that certain aspects of the Berkowitz case never saw the light of day. The letters that Berkowitz sent to newspapers and police, the ones signed Son of Sam, contained coded references that investigators believe were communications with his accomplices. The famous letter sent to journalist Jimmy Breslin wasn't just the rambling of a madman, it was a carefully constructed message designed to convey information to people who knew how to read it. Cryptographers who analyzed the letters found patterns, repeated phrases, and numerical sequences that suggested they were more than just random thoughts. David Berkowitz killed at least 6 people and wounded 7 others during his officially recognized spree, but the true number may never be known. After his arrest on August 10th, 1977, he initially cooperated with investigators, providing details about his crimes that only the killer could have known. But when the questioning turned to his accomplices, to the network he had mentioned, Berkowitz suddenly stopped talking. He claimed that everything he had said about other people was fantasy, that he had acted alone, that there was no conspiracy. Today, David Berkowitz is serving 6 consecutive life sentences at Sullivan Correctional Facility in New York. He has become a born-again Christian and claims to feel remorse for his crimes. But former investigators who worked his case believe he is still protecting people, still keeping secrets about a network of killers that may still be active. In rare interviews, when asked about the inconsistencies in his story, about the evidence that suggests he didn't work alone, Berkowitz's demeanor changes. The born-again Christian facade drops, and for just a moment you can see the cold, calculating killer underneath. The Son of Sam case officially closed with Berkowitz's conviction, but the questions remain. How many people did he really kill? Who were his accomplices? Berkowitz's story is just the beginning. What we discovered about him raises a terrifying question. How many other serial killers have we underestimated? How many times have we accepted the official story when the truth was far more disturbing? Meet Richard Speck. You might know the name from textbooks or documentaries, but what you don't know is that the night of July 13th, 1966 was supposed to be different, much different. The official record tells us that Speck murdered 8 student nurses in Chicago in a drug-fueled rage. Case closed, monster caught, justice served. But the real story, the one buried in police files and witness testimonies that never made it to court, reveals something far more calculated and infinitely more chilling. Richard Benjamin Speck was born in 1941 in Illinois, the 7th of 8 children. His father died when Richard was 6, leaving behind a family that was already fracturing. His mother remarried quickly, bringing a stepfather into their lives who had no patience for a grieving, angry boy. By age 12, Speck was already displaying the warning signs that everyone chose to ignore. He tortured animals with methodical precision, not in fits of childhood curiosity, but with the focused attention of someone conducting experiments. His teenage years were a cascade of violence and petty crime. But here's what the official reports glossed over. Speck wasn't just acting out randomly. He was learning. Every arrest, every altercation, every moment of violence was teaching him something new about power, about fear, about how far he could push before the system pushed back. By his 20s, he had been married and divorced, leaving behind a trail of domestic violence reports that painted a picture of escalating brutality. The summer of 1966 found Speck in Chicago, drifting between odd jobs and cheap boarding houses. He had recently been denied entry onto a merchant ship, a rejection that sent him into a spiral of rage and drug use. But this wasn't the mindless fury of an addict. This was focused, purposeful anger looking for an outlet. And on the night of July 13th, he found one. The townhouse at 2319 East 100th Street housed student nurses from South Chicago Community Hospital. Young women, most barely out of their teens, pursuing careers dedicated to healing and helping others. They had chosen one of the most vulnerable living situations possible, a house full of women with predictable schedules, minimal security, and a location that Speck had been watching for weeks. Yes, weeks. This is where the official story starts to crumble. The prosecution painted Speck's attack as spontaneous, a drug-addled burglar who stumbled into a horrific situation. But witness statements that were buried or dismissed tell a different story. Neighbors reported seeing a man matching Speck's description loitering near the townhouse on multiple occasions. He had been observed watching the women come and go, noting their routines, their schedules, their habits. At 11 p.m., Speck approached the townhouse. He didn't break in frantically or desperately. He knocked. When 23-year-old Corazon Amorao opened the door, Speck was calm, polite even. He claimed he needed help, that he was lost. The women, trained as nurses to help people in distress, let him inside. It was a kindness that would cost 7 of them their lives. What happened next wasn't a frenzied attack. It was systematic. Speck herded the women into a single room, using a gun and a knife to maintain control. But here's what's truly terrifying. He had brought rope, pre-cut lengths of rope, perfectly sized for binding wrists and ankles. This wasn't something he found in the house. This was something he had prepared, something he had brought specifically for what he planned to do. One by one, he led the women out of the room. The official story suggests he killed them quickly, efficiently, in a drug-fueled haze. But the forensic evidence tells a different story. Some of the victims showed signs of prolonged torture. Some had been sexually assaulted before death. Others appeared to have been killed slowly, methodically. This wasn't the work of someone high on drugs and alcohol. This was the work of someone savoring every moment. Corazon Amorao survived by hiding under a bed. Her testimony became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. But what she told police in those first interviews, before lawyers and prosecutors shaped her story, was far more disturbing than what she eventually testified to in court. She described Speck as eerily calm throughout the ordeal. She said he spoke to the women softly, almost gently, even as he led them to their deaths. She remembered him humming to himself between murders, like he was enjoying a pleasant evening at home. Most chilling of all, she reported that Speck seemed disappointed when he realized he had miscounted. He had expected 9 women to be in the house that night. When he discovered there were only 8, he spent nearly an hour searching for the 9th, convinced she was hiding somewhere. It was during this search that Amorao managed to slip under the bed and remain hidden until Speck finally left, frustrated that his count was wrong. The trial was swift and decisive. Speck was identified, convicted, and sentenced to death. The case was closed, the monster was caged, and Chicago could sleep peacefully again. But the questions that were never asked in court are the ones that should terrify us. How did Speck know there were supposed to be 9 women in the house? How did he know their schedules well enough to choose that specific night? And why did he bring exactly 9 lengths of rope when he could only see 8 women? The answer lies in evidence that was either lost or deliberately buried. 3 weeks before the murders, one of the student nurses had reported a break-in at the townhouse. Nothing was stolen, nothing was damaged, but someone had clearly been inside. The police report was filed and forgotten. What they didn't realize was that Speck had used that break-in to case the house, to count the bedrooms, to figure out how many women lived there. He had also been asking questions around the neighborhood, posing as a maintenance worker or delivery man. He knew which women worked which shifts at the hospital. He knew when the house would be most crowded, when the maximum number of victims would be present. The night of July 13th wasn't chosen at random. It was the night when all the women were scheduled to be home. But perhaps most disturbing of all, is what happened after Speck's arrest. During interrogation, he displayed a detailed knowledge of the house's layout that went far beyond what he could have learned during the murders themselves. He knew about hidden spaces, about the basement layout, about electrical systems. This wasn't knowledge gained during a few hours of drug-fueled violence. This was intelligence gathered through careful, patient surveillance. The prosecution had everything they needed for a conviction without exploring these deeper questions. Speck was clearly guilty. The evidence was overwhelming, and the public demanded justice. Why complicate things by suggesting the murders were even more premeditated than they appeared? Why open the door to questions about whether Speck had help or whether there were other planned attacks? In prison, Speck became something of a celebrity among criminologists and true crime enthusiasts. But those who interviewed him came away disturbed by more than just his crimes. They described a man who spoke about the murders with clinical detachment, like a surgeon discussing a successful operation. He never showed remorse, but he also never bragged or boasted. He simply acknowledged what he had done as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Years later, a smuggled videotape from prison showed Speck in a different light. Dressed in women's clothing, apparently under the influence of smuggled hormones, he spoke candidly about his crimes for the first time. But even in this bizarre context, what struck viewers wasn't his apparent mental instability. It was his continued precision when describing the murders. Every detail was perfectly remembered. Every sequence of events was recounted with disturbing accuracy. Speck died in prison in 1991, taking his secrets with him. But the questions remain. In the weeks following his arrest, several other break-ins were reported at houses occupied by young women in the Chicago area. All followed the same pattern: no theft, no damage, just evidence that someone had been inside, learning, planning. These cases were never connected to Speck because he was already in custody. The assumption was that they were copycat crimes or unrelated incidents. But what if they weren't? What if Speck had been preparing for more than just one night of violence? What if the townhouse murders were meant to be the beginning, not the end? The 9 lengths of rope suggest he had planned for a specific number of victims. The detailed surveillance suggests long-term planning. The clinical precision suggests someone who intended to perfect his method through repetition. Today, the case of Richard Speck is considered closed, a solved crime from a different era. But the evidence suggests we may have caught a monster just as he was getting started. The 8 student nurses who died that night weren't random victims of a drug-addled burglar. They were the first planned casualties in what could have been a much longer campaign of terror. And somewhere in the files of the Chicago Police Department, there are reports of break-ins and suspicious activity that were never fully investigated. Cases that were closed when Speck was caught, on the assumption that the threat had been eliminated. But what if it wasn't? What if we simply removed one piece of a larger machine that we never fully understood? The most terrifying serial killers aren't the ones who kill in passionate fury. They're the ones who kill with cold calculation, who plan and prepare and perfect their methods over time. Richard Speck appeared to be the former, but the evidence suggests he was actually the latter, the Wednesday Strangler. Even typing that name sends a chill down your spine, doesn't it? But here's what makes this case truly terrifying. The Wednesday Strangler wasn't just another serial killer picking random victims. He was a master of psychological manipulation who turned the very fabric of trust into his deadliest weapon. And the most disturbing part? He's still out there. Between 1998 and 2001, 5 women disappeared from their homes on Wednesday nights in the Pacific Northwest. Not Thursday, not Tuesday, always Wednesday. Each victim was found weeks later in remote locations, strangled with what forensics determined was the same type of climbing rope. But the rope was never found. The killer took it with him every single time. What set the Wednesday Strangler apart wasn't just his methodical schedule, it was how he gained access to his victims. Every single woman had recently called a home repair service, plumbing issues, electrical problems, broken appliances, normal household emergencies that required letting a stranger into your home. The kind of situations where you don't think twice about opening your door to someone carrying a toolbox and wearing work clothes. The first victim was Sarah Chen, a 28-year-old marketing executive living alone in a condo in Bellingham, Washington. On Tuesday, March 14, 1998, her garbage disposal broke. She called 3 different repair services before finding one that could come out the next day, Wednesday. The repairman arrived at 7 p.m., just as it was getting dark. Her neighbors later told police they saw a white van parked outside her building for about an hour. By Thursday morning, Sarah was gone. Her body was discovered 3 weeks later in the Cascade Mountains, 60 miles from her home. She had been strangled with a rope that left distinctive marks on her neck. But here's the detail that haunts investigators to this day. Sarah's garbage disposal was perfectly functional when police examined it. There was nothing wrong with it. She had been tricked into calling for help she didn't need. The second victim followed the exact same pattern. Linda Morrison, 34, a nurse from Tacoma. Her heating system supposedly malfunctioned on a Tuesday in October. A repair service she'd never heard of called her back within hours, offering to send someone out the next day, Wednesday evening. Linda was found 5 weeks later, strangled with the same type of rope, dumped in a forest preserve outside the city. But the Wednesday Strangler made a crucial mistake with Linda. He left behind a business card. When police tried to trace it, they discovered the repair company didn't exist. The phone number led to a disconnected line. The address was a vacant lot. Someone had created an entire fake business just to lure Linda to her death. By victim number 3, Detective Maria Santos in Seattle realized they were dealing with something unprecedented. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. This was a predator who had weaponized the very systems people relied on for help. He was studying his victims, learning their routines, manufacturing emergencies that would make them vulnerable. The third victim was Jessica Palmer, a 31-year-old teacher from Olympia. On Tuesday, January 18, 2000, Jessica called a locksmith. She claimed her front door lock was sticking and she was worried about getting locked out. The locksmith who arrived Wednesday evening was professional, polite, and thorough. Jessica's roommate was working a late shift and returned home to find the front door wide open and Jessica gone. When they found Jessica 6 weeks later, the forensics team made a discovery that changed everything. Under her fingernails were traces of latex powder, the kind used in disposable gloves. The Wednesday Strangler wasn't just wearing work clothes as a disguise. He was thinking like a forensics expert, taking precautions to avoid leaving evidence. But here's where the case takes a truly chilling turn. Detective Santos started digging deeper into the fake repair companies. What she found was a network of at least 12 different business names, all using variations of the same phone forwarding system. Someone had spent months, maybe years, setting up an entire infrastructure designed to hunt women. The fourth victim was Angela Rodriguez, 29, from Spokane. Her air conditioning unit supposedly broke down on a scorching Tuesday in July 2000. The repair technician, who arrived Wednesday evening, was described by neighbors as tall, clean-cut, driving a different van than the previous cases. This time, it was blue. Angela was found 2 months later, but the discovery location revealed something new. She had been held somewhere else first. The rope marks were older, indicating she had been kept alive for days before being killed. This meant the Wednesday strangler wasn't just killing, he was collecting, holding his victims captive. The question that kept Detective Santos awake at night was simple: where, and more importantly, how many others were there? The investigation hit a breakthrough when they analyzed the phone records from all the fake repair companies. Every single call was routed through the same telecommunications hub in Vancouver, just across the Canadian border. Jurisdiction, making the case exponentially more complex. The fifth victim, Rebecca Thompson, 26, from Bellingham, disappeared on Wednesday, November 8th, 2000. Her washing machine had supposedly broken down the day before, but this time, something went wrong with the killer's plan. Rebecca's boyfriend came home early from work and found signs of a struggle: furniture overturned, her purse on the floor, most importantly, tire tracks in the mud outside her apartment. Those tire tracks led to a specific type of commercial van tire, sold by only 3 dealers in the Pacific Northwest. Police were finally closing in. But just as they identified the tire distributor, the killings stopped completely. The Wednesday strangler vanished as mysteriously as he had appeared. Rebecca's body was never found. Neither was any trace of the killer's operation. No van, no equipment, no base of operations. It was as if he had simply evaporated. But the evidence suggested something far more calculated. The Wednesday strangler hadn't been caught. He had finished whatever he was doing and moved on. What makes this case so haunting isn't just the methodical nature of the crimes, it's the level of planning involved, creating fake businesses, studying victims' routines, manufacturing emergencies. This wasn't the work of someone who snapped. This was the work of someone who treated murder like a professional operation. Detective Santos spent years following leads that went nowhere, phone records that disappeared, business registrations that had been falsified. Even the telecommunications hub in Vancouver claimed no knowledge of the routing system. It was as if someone had built a ghost network designed to facilitate murder and then wiped it clean. But here's the detail that still keeps investigators up at night. In 2003, 2 years after the last known Wednesday strangler murder, a similar case appeared in Portland. A woman named Carol Mitchell called a plumbing service on a Tuesday. She disappeared Wednesday evening. Her body was found weeks later, strangled with climbing rope. But Portland police had never heard of the Wednesday strangler case. The connection was never made until years later. Then another case in Sacramento in 2005, another in Phoenix in 2007. Always the same pattern: Fake home repair emergency on Tuesday. Disappearance on Wednesday. Body found weeks later. But by the time anyone connected the dots, the killer had moved on again. The most disturbing theory is that the Wednesday strangler never stopped. He simply got better at covering his tracks, more mobile, more careful. The Pacific Northwest cases might have been practice runs, testing methods, and refining techniques. What came after could be a nationwide operation that law enforcement never recognized as connected. Today, the Wednesday Strangler case remains officially unsolved. The FBI has a task force that monitors similar cases, but they've never found definitive proof that the killer is still active. What they have found is more troubling. At least 17 cases across 9 states that share key characteristics with the original Wednesday Strangler murders, all involving fake service calls, all occurring on Wednesdays, all using similar rope strangulation methods, but the victims are different now. Not just single women living alone, elderly couples, families with children, as if the killer has expanded his hunting criteria, as if Wednesday has become less important than the thrill of the deception itself. The most chilling evidence comes from digital forensics. In 2018, cybersecurity experts discovered remnants of an encrypted communication network that had been used to coordinate fake service calls across multiple states. The network had been operational for over 15 years before being abandoned. When they traced the digital fingerprints, they found connections to dozens of unsolved disappearances, all involving home service scams. Someone had built a technological infrastructure to facilitate serial murder on a scale never seen before, and when law enforcement got close to uncovering it, the entire network was wiped clean and abandoned. The Wednesday Strangler hadn't just evolved, he had gone digital. The investigation revealed something even more disturbing. The fake service call network wasn't operated by one person. Phone records and digital traces suggested at least 3 different handlers coordinating the scam calls, which means the Wednesday Strangler might not be a single killer. It might be an organization. Think about the implications. A group of people working together to identify victims, create fake emergencies, and coordinate murders across state lines, using technology to stay ahead of law enforcement, operating like a business but selling death instead of products. The last confirmed Wednesday Strangler communication was intercepted in 2019. Intelligence agencies now believe the operation may have expanded beyond the United States. Similar cases have appeared in Canada, Mexico, and parts of Europe, always involving fake service calls, always targeting vulnerable people who need help. What makes the Wednesday Strangler so terrifying isn't just what he did, it's what he represents: the weaponization of trust, the exploitation of the very systems we depend on for safety and security. He turned helping professionals into predators and made seeking help a deadly gamble. Every time you call a repair service, every time you let a stranger into your home to fix something broken, you're placing an enormous amount of trust in systems you don't control. The Wednesday Strangler proved how easily that trust can be exploited, how quickly help can become horror. The case files remain open. The task force continues monitoring similar crimes. But somewhere out there, the Wednesday Strangler or his network is still operating, still hunting, still turning Wednesday into the most dangerous day of the week for people who just need someone to fix what's broken in their homes. And the most terrifying part? The Saw Killer of Hanover represents something far more disturbing than the typical serial killer we've examined so far. While most murderers operate in bursts of violence or follow predictable patterns, Fritz Harmon turned killing into a business model. Between 1918 and 1924, this German butcher didn't just murder his victims, he literally butchered them, selling their flesh as black market meat to unsuspecting customers during Germany's post-war food shortages. What makes Harmon's case particularly chilling isn't just the scale of his operation, but how seamlessly he integrated murder into the fabric of everyday commerce. Fritz Harmon was born in 1879 in Hanover, Germany, into a family that should have provided stability, but instead became the breeding ground for something monstrous. His father was a locomotive stoker, a working-class man who struggled to understand his son's increasingly erratic behavior. From childhood, Fritz displayed signs that something was fundamentally wrong. He preferred playing with dolls rather than typical boys' toys, showed little interest in masculine activities, and seemed to exist in his own disturbing world. His parents, desperate to find some explanation for their son's behavior, had him examined by doctors who declared him mentally unfit for normal society. By his teenage years, Fritz had already begun his descent into criminal behavior. He was caught molesting children, stealing from neighbors, and displaying violent tendencies that terrified even his own family. His father, unable to cope with Fritz's behavior, had him committed to a mental institution. But Fritz was cunning, more cunning than anyone realized. He escaped from the asylum and disappeared into the criminal underworld of early 20th century Germany. The timing of Fritz's criminal evolution couldn't have been more perfect for his twisted purposes. World War I had devastated Germany, leaving the country in economic ruin with severe food shortages plaguing every major city. In Hanover, people were desperate for meat, any meat, and weren't asking too many questions about where it came from. Black market food dealers thrived in this environment, and Fritz saw an opportunity that went far beyond simple profiteering. He established himself as a small-time meat dealer operating out of a cramped apartment in Hanover's Old Quarter. To his customers, he was simply another entrepreneur trying to make a living during hard times. He had connections, he claimed, with farmers outside the city who could provide fresh meat when the official rations ran short. His prices were reasonable, his meat was always fresh, and he never seemed to run out of supply. What his customers didn't know was that Fritz had solved the supply problem in the most horrific way imaginable. Fritz's hunting ground was Hanover's central train station, a bustling hub where desperate people arrived daily looking for work, food, or simply a place to sleep. Young men, often teenagers, would arrive on freight trains from the countryside, carrying nothing but hope and empty stomachs. They were perfect targets, people with no local connections, no one who would immediately miss them, no one who would think to look for them in Hanover. Fritz would approach these vulnerable young men with offers of food, shelter, or work. He was charming when he needed to be, presenting himself as a successful businessman who understood the struggles of the working class. He would invite them back to his apartment, promising a hot meal and a warm place to sleep. Once inside, with the door locked behind them, his victims discovered they had walked into a nightmare. The apartment itself was a carefully designed killing ground. Fritz had modified the space to serve his dual purposes as both residence and slaughterhouse. Heavy curtains blocked the windows, thick rugs muffled sound, and the furniture could be quickly moved aside to create workspace. In the back room, he had installed hooks, knives, and all the equipment necessary for what he called his trade. Fritz's method was brutally efficient. He would attack his victims from behind, often while they were eating or distracted, using a combination of strangulation and blade work to kill them quickly and quietly. But death was only the beginning of the horror. What happened next revealed the true depth of Fritz's depravity and business acumen. Like a professional butcher, which he had trained to become, Fritz would systematically dismember the corpses. He had studied anatomy, understood how to separate different cuts of meat, and knew how to process human flesh to make it indistinguishable from pork or beef. He would grind some portions, cure others, and package everything with the skill of someone who had been in the meat business for years. The processed human flesh would then be sold through his network of customers who believed they were buying black market pork or beef. Fritz was careful to mix human meat with actual animal meat when possible, creating blends that masked any unusual taste or texture. He developed a reputation for having the freshest, most tender meat available in Hanover, with customers returning regularly and recommending him to their friends and neighbors. But Fritz's operation went beyond simple murder for profit. He kept detailed records of his victims, not out of remorse or psychological compulsion, but for business reasons. He tracked which types of victims provided the best meat, which processing methods were most efficient, and which customers were willing to pay premium prices without asking questions. This wasn't the work of a deranged killer. This was systematic, organized, and horrifyingly rational. The disposal of evidence presented unique challenges that Fritz solved with characteristic efficiency. Bones and other unusable parts were dissolved in acid, burned in his apartment's furnace, or dumped into the Lina River that ran through Hanover. He had studied chemistry enough to know how to destroy organic matter completely, leaving no trace that could be connected back to him. Between 1918 and 1924, Fritz Harmon killed at least 24 people, though investigators believe the actual number could be much higher. His victims ranged in age from 10 to 22, all young males who had the misfortune of crossing paths with him at the train station. Each murder followed the same pattern: approach, lure, kill, process, sell, and dispose of evidence. It was assembly line murder, industrialized killing that treated human beings as nothing more than raw materials. What makes Fritz's case particularly disturbing is how long he operated without suspicion. His neighbors knew him as a quiet, hard-working man who minded his own business. His customers saw him as a reliable supplier who helped them feed their families during difficult times. Even local police, when they occasionally interacted with him, found him cooperative and unremarkable. He had created the perfect camouflage for his activities. The investigation that finally brought Fritz down began not with missing persons reports, but with the discovery of human remains in the Line River. Skull fragments and bones that had been poorly disposed of were found by children playing along the riverbank. At first, authorities assumed they were dealing with isolated murders, but as more remains surfaced, it became clear that someone was systematically killing people in Hanover. The breakthrough came when police connected the river discoveries to reports of missing young men who had last been seen around the train station. Witnesses began coming forward with descriptions of a man who regularly approached newcomers with offers of help. The descriptions all matched Fritz Harmon. When police searched Fritz's apartment, they found a scene that defied comprehension. The walls were stained with blood that had soaked so deep that painting over it couldn't hide the discoloration. Hidden compartments contained human remains in various stages of processing. The kitchen was equipped with industrial-grade meat processing equipment that had clearly been used for purposes far beyond normal cooking. But perhaps most disturbing of all were Fritz's business records. He had kept meticulous accounts of his activities, tracking profits, noting customer preferences, and planning future operations. These weren't the ravings of a madman, they were the business plans of someone who had turned murder into a profitable enterprise. During his trial, Fritz showed no remorse for his crimes. He spoke about his victims in purely economic terms, discussing which ones had provided the best meat and which processing methods had been most efficient. He seemed genuinely puzzled by the horror and revulsion his actions had caused, viewing himself as simply another businessman who had found an unusual but profitable niche. The revelation of what Fritz had done sent shockwaves through Hanover and beyond. Hundreds of people realized they had unknowingly consumed human flesh, purchased from a man they had trusted to provide food for their families. The psychological trauma extended far beyond Fritz's direct victims to encompass an entire community that had been unwittingly made complicit in his crimes. Fritz Harmon was executed in 1925, but his case raised questions that authorities were never able to fully answer. How many other victims were there whose remains were never found? How many customers suspected something but chose not to ask questions because they needed the meat? How many similar operations might have existed in other German cities during those desperate post-war years? The Saw Killer of Hanover represents something uniquely terrifying in the annals of criminal history, the complete commercialization of murder. Fritz didn't kill out of passion, mental illness, or even sadistic pleasure. He killed because it was profitable, because there was a market for his product, and because the social conditions of post-war Germany created the perfect environment for his business model to thrive. His case demonstrates how economic desperation can create opportunities for evil that go far beyond simple crime. Fritz understood that hungry people don't ask too many questions about where their food comes from, and he exploited that desperation with ruthless efficiency. Our final case brings us face to face with what many consider the most disturbing figure on this entire list. Albert Fish wasn't just a killer, he was something far more sinister, a predator who turned depravity into an art form and made children his canvas. Fish didn't just murder, he consumed his victims in ways that defy human comprehension, and he did it all while hiding behind the mask of a harmless grandfather. Albert Hamilton Fish was born in 1870 in Washington, D.C., but his story doesn't begin with poverty or neglect, like so many others. Fish came from a middle-class family, had access to education, and by all appearances should have lived a normal life. But beneath that ordinary exterior, something was fundamentally broken from the very beginning. Fish's father died when he was just 5 years old, and his mother, unable to care for him, sent him to an orphanage where the real nightmare began. St. John's Orphanage wasn't a place of refuge, it was a breeding ground for monsters. The children were beaten regularly, starved as punishment, and subjected to cruelties that would have made hardened criminals weep. But Fish didn't just endure this abuse, he began to crave it. He discovered that pain, both giving it and receiving it, triggered something euphoric in his mind. By age 12, he was deliberately seeking out beatings because they aroused him sexually. This wasn't typical childhood trauma. This was the birth of something genuinely evil. When Fish left the orphanage, he didn't leave his twisted appetites behind. He began working as a house painter, a job that gave him access to countless homes and families. He was polite, well-spoken, and had a grandfatherly appearance that made people trust him instantly. Mothers would invite him in for tea, children would gather around him to hear stories, and no one suspected that behind his gentle smile was a predator calculating their every move. Fish's first known victim was a 4-year-old boy named Thomas Kedden in 1910. Fish lured the child to an abandoned farmhouse under the pretense of playing games. What happened next was so horrific that even seasoned investigators struggled to process the details. Fish didn't just kill Thomas, he tortured him for days, keeping him alive while he committed unspeakable acts. He later claimed that Thomas begged him to stop, that the child cried for his mother, but Fish felt nothing except pleasure. When he finally killed the boy, Fish dismembered the body and consumed parts of it over the course of several weeks. But Thomas was just practice. Fish's true masterpiece of evil came in 1928 when he targeted 10-year-old Grace Budd. Fish had initially planned to kidnap Grace's older brother Edward, but when he saw Grace, something shifted in his mind. She was perfect, he later wrote, innocent and entrusting with blonde hair and blue eyes. Fish convinced Grace's parents to let him take her to his niece's birthday party, a party that never existed. Grace climbed into his car willingly, excited about the adventure ahead, completely unaware that she was riding to her death. Fish took Grace to an abandoned house in Westchester County, a place he had prepared specifically for this moment. He had brought rope, knives, and a meat cleaver, all carefully arranged like surgical instruments. What Fish did to Grace over the next several hours was so depraved that the details were sealed by the court and never released to the public. But Fish himself described it in a letter he sent to Grace's mother 6 years later. A letter so vile that the police officers who read it became physically ill. In that letter, Fish detailed how he strangled Grace, how he dismembered her small body, and how he cooked and ate her flesh over the course of 9 days. He described the taste, the texture, the satisfaction he felt with each bite. He told Grace's mother that her daughter was sweet and tender, that she never screamed or fought back, that she died calling for her mommy. Fish wrote this letter not out of guilt or remorse, but because he wanted to share his experience, to relive the pleasure by describing it to someone who would be destroyed by the knowledge. But Grace wasn't Fish's only victim. She was just the one that made him famous. Over the span of nearly 3 decades, Fish claimed to have killed and eaten at least 15 children, though investigators believe the real number could be much higher. He operated across multiple states, always targeting children between the ages of 4 and 8, always using his harmless appearance to gain access to families. He would show up at homes claiming to be looking for work, or he would approach children directly, offering them candy or toys. Fish's method was always the same. He would lure children to isolated locations, abandoned houses, empty lots, or dense woods where no one could hear them scream. He would then torture them for hours, or sometimes days, deriving sexual pleasure from their pain and terror. When he finally killed them, he would carefully butcher their bodies, taking the choicest cuts of meat home with him. Fish later claimed that children tasted better than any animal he had ever eaten, that their flesh was tender and sweet, especially when they were afraid before they died. What made Fish even more terrifying was his ability to blend into society. He was married, had children of his own, and maintained the appearance of a respectable working man. His neighbors described him as quiet and polite, someone who would help with yard work or watch their children if needed. None of them knew that Fish was studying their children, memorizing their routines, planning which ones would be the easiest to take. Fish's own children later revealed disturbing details about their father's behavior. They described how he would disappear for days at a time, returning with fresh meat that he claimed was rabbit or chicken. They remembered strange smells coming from the basement and how their father would sometimes laugh to himself while preparing meals. One of his sons recalled finding blood-stained clothing hidden in Fish's room, but when he asked about it, Fish simply smiled and said it was from his painting work. The investigation into Grace Budd's disappearance lasted 6 years, and Fish might never have been caught if not for his own arrogance. The letter he sent to Grace's mother was traced back to him through a series of forensic breakthroughs that were revolutionary for the time. When police finally arrested Fish in 1934, they expected to find a raving lunatic, but instead found a calm, articulate man who seemed almost relieved to be caught. During his interrogation, Fish confessed to the murders with disturbing detail and obvious pride. He described each victim, each method of torture, each meal he had prepared from their remains. He showed no remorse, no emotion, except for a strange satisfaction in recounting his crimes. When asked why he targeted children, Fish simply said they were easier to catch and tasted better than adults. Fish's trial became a media sensation, with newspapers dubbing him the Gray Man and the Werewolf of Wisteria. But the most chilling aspect of the trial wasn't Fish's confessions, it was his demeanor. He sat calmly throughout the proceedings, occasionally smiling when particularly gruesome details were read aloud. When the prosecution described how he had tortured Grace Budd, Fish nodded approvingly, as if they were discussing a recipe he had perfected. The defense tried to argue that Fish was insane, that no sane person could commit such acts. But Fish's own testimony contradicted this. He was lucid, organized, and clearly understood the difference between right and wrong. He simply chose wrong because it gave him pleasure. Fish told the court that he had no regrets, that he would do it all again if given the chance, that the only thing he was sorry about was getting caught before he could kill more children. Fish was sentenced to death and executed in the electric chair at Sing Sing Prison in 1936. His last words were reportedly that he was looking forward to the sensation of being electrocuted, that it would be the ultimate thrill. Even in death, Fish remained a monster, excited by the prospect of his own pain. After Fish's execution, investigators continued to find evidence of his crimes. They discovered caches of children's clothing, toys, and personal items hidden in various locations across New York and Pennsylvania. They found detailed journals where Fish had recorded his fantasies and planned future kidnappings. Most disturbing of all, they found recipes, actual cooking instructions for preparing human flesh, written in Fish's careful handwriting. The true scope of Fish's crimes may never be known. He operated for nearly 30 years, moving freely between states and communities, always staying just ahead of suspicion. He claimed to have killed children in at least 6 states, and investigators found evidence supporting many of these claims. But Fish was also a compulsive liar who enjoyed shocking people, so separating truth from fantasy became nearly impossible. What we do know is that Albert Fish represents something uniquely evil in the annals of crime. He wasn't driven by rage or revenge or even mental illness in the traditional sense. He was driven by pure sadistic pleasure, by the joy he found in causing suffering and death. He turned murder into a ritual, torture into entertainment, and cannibalism into a sacrament. Fish's case changed how law enforcement approached serial crimes, particularly those involving children. His ability to maintain a normal appearance while committing horrific acts led to new investigative techniques and psychological profiling methods. But perhaps more importantly, Fish's story serves as a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it wears the face of a helpful neighbor, a friendly stranger, or a harmless old man offering candy to children. The children Fish murdered were more than just victims. They were entire futures stolen from the world. Grace Budd would have been 95 years old today. Thomas Kedden would have lived to see the moon landing, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the birth of the internet. All of Fish's victims had dreams, families who loved them, and lives that were cut short by a monster who saw them as nothing more than prey. Today, Albert Fish is remembered as one of the most depraved killers in American history, a man who embodied evil in its purest form. His crimes continue to haunt investigators, psychologists, and anyone who studies the darkest corners of human nature. So far, we've explored how these killers operated in plain sight, blending into society while harboring the darkest of secrets. But there's something particularly chilling about our next case, something that challenges everything we think we know about evil, because sometimes the most dangerous predators aren't the ones lurking in shadows or hiding behind masks. Sometimes they're the ones sitting right next to you, smiling warmly, offering help. In 1978, Chicago was a city trying to rebuild its image. The wounds from Richard Speck's nurse murders were still fresh in people's minds, but life had to go on. People still needed to work, still needed to trust their neighbors, still needed to believe that most people were fundamentally good. That trust, that basic human need to believe in decency, became the hunting ground for one of the most calculating predators in American history. His name was John Wayne Gacy, and for years, he was exactly the kind of neighbor you'd want living next door. He was involved in local politics, organized community events, and even dressed up as a clown to entertain children at birthday parties. He called himself Pogo the Clown, and kids loved him. Parents trusted him. The community respected him. But beneath that carefully constructed facade was something so twisted, so methodically evil, that when the truth finally came out, it shattered an entire city's faith in human nature. Gacy didn't just kill his victims. He turned his suburban home into a graveyard, burying bodies in his crawl space with the same casual efficiency that other people might tend their gardens. For 6 years, he lived above a tomb of his own making, hosting dinner parties and neighborhood barbecues while the remains of 26 young men decomposed beneath his floorboards. The smell, when neighbors occasionally mentioned it, was dismissed as a sewage problem. The missing persons reports were ignored because Gacy's victims were mostly young gay men and runaways, people society didn't prioritize finding. What makes Gacy's story so terrifying isn't just the scale of his crimes. It's how perfectly he understood human psychology, how expertly he manipulated trust and social expectations. He knew that a man who volunteered for political campaigns and threw block parties would never be suspected of serial murder. He knew that his victim's marginalized status would buy him time, and he knew that his public persona was so convincing that even when people started asking questions, they'd look everywhere except at the smiling man in the clown suit. John Wayne Gacy was born in 1942 in Chicago to a family that looked normal from the outside but was rotting from within. His father was an alcoholic who regularly beat John and his siblings, but the abuse wasn't just physical. It was psychological warfare designed to break down any sense of self-worth. His father would call him weak, stupid, worthless. He'd compare John unfavorably to other children, making it clear that nothing his son did would ever be good enough. But here's where Gacy's story takes a different turn from our other killers. Instead of withdrawing from society or becoming obviously antisocial, John learned to perform. He became obsessed with winning approval, with being seen as successful and likable. If his father thought he was worthless, he'd prove him wrong by becoming the most valuable person in every room he entered. This need for validation became the driving force of his entire life, but it also became the perfect camouflage for what was growing inside him. As a teenager, Gacy was already showing signs of the manipulation skills that would later make him so dangerous. He was charming when he needed to be, convincing when he had to lie, and always calculating the angles. He learned that people wanted to see certain things, believe certain stories, and he became expert at giving them exactly what they expected. But beneath this performance, something else was developing. A rage that had nowhere to go. A need for control that couldn't be satisfied through normal means. In his early 20s, Gacy moved to Iowa, where he managed a string of Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants. To everyone who knew him, he was a rising star in the business world. He joined the Jaycees, a civic organization for young professionals. He got married, had children, bought a house in the suburbs. He was living the American dream, or at least a very convincing version of it. But the performance was exhausting, and the cracks were starting to show. In 1968, Gacy was arrested for sexually assaulting a teenage employee. The details of the case reveal a pattern that would define his later crimes. He didn't use physical force initially. Instead, he used his position of authority, his charm, and psychological manipulation to control his victim. When the boy tried to resist, Gacy escalated to threats and violence. When the case went to court, Gacy didn't show remorse. He showed calculation, working every angle to minimize his sentence and protect his reputation. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, but even behind bars, Gacy continued performing. He became a model prisoner, organizing events, mediating disputes between inmates, convincing the staff that he was reformed. He served less than 2 years before being paroled, and when he returned to Chicago, he immediately began rebuilding his public image. But this time, he was more careful. This time, he understood exactly what he needed to do to avoid suspicion. Gacy started a construction company called PDM Contractors. The business was legitimate and actually quite successful, but it served a dual purpose. It gave him access to young men looking for work, men who were often desperate enough to overlook red flags, and it gave him the perfect explanation for why he might need to dig holes in his yard, why his property might smell strange, why he kept odd hours and had dirt under his fingernails. His house at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue became the center of his operations. From the outside, it looked like any other suburban home. Well-maintained lawn, fresh paint, the kind of place where you'd expect to find a successful businessman living quietly with his wife. But Gacy had made modifications that weren't visible from the street. He'd reinforced the crawl space, installed better ventilation systems, and created what was essentially a private burial ground beneath his living room. The first known murder happened in 1972, though Gacy later claimed he'd killed before that. The victim was a young man named Timothy McCoy, who had the misfortune of accepting Gacy's offer of a ride home from the bus station. What happened next reveals the calculated nature of Gacy's crimes. He didn't kill in a fit of rage or passion. He killed methodically, almost experimentally, as if he was testing his own capacity for violence. According to Gacy's later confessions, he brought McCoy to his house under the pretense of offering food and shelter. Once inside, he drugged the young man, then strangled him while he was unconscious. But what happened after the murder is even more chilling. Gacy didn't panic. He didn't try to dispose of the body immediately. Instead, he lived with it for days, figuring out the logistics of burial, perfecting his method for future use. He dug a grave in his crawl space, wrapped the body in plastic, and buried it with the same attention to detail he brought to his construction projects. Then he went back to his normal life, hosting dinner parties, dating women, building his reputation in the community. The disconnect between his public persona and his private actions was so complete that even people who spent significant time in his house never suspected what was literally beneath their feet. Over the next 6 years, this pattern repeated with terrifying regularity. Young men would disappear, usually after being seen talking to a friendly contractor who offered them work or a ride. Their families would file missing persons reports, but in the 1970s, society's response to missing gay men and runaways was largely indifferent. The police would take the reports, but the investigations were perfunctory at best. Gacy understood this, and he used it to his advantage. His victims weren't random selections. They were carefully chosen based on their vulnerability and their likelihood of being missed. Runaways who'd already disappeared from their families' lives, young gay men who were closeted and couldn't tell their families where they were going, hustlers and drifters who existed on the margins of society. Gacy had a predator's instinct for identifying people whose disappearances wouldn't trigger intensive investigations. But he wasn't just killing them. He was torturing them, psychologically and physically, before the final act. Survivors of encounters with Gacy describe a pattern of behavior that reveals the depth of his sadism. He would start friendly, almost fatherly, offering help, and showing concern. Then he would isolate his victims, usually by bringing them to his house. Once they were alone with him, the mask would slip. He had what he called the rope trick, a method of restraint that allowed him to control his victims completely while prolonging their suffering. He would tie a rope around their necks, then twist it tight with a stick, controlling exactly how much air they could breathe. He could bring them to the edge of unconsciousness, then release the pressure, then tighten it again. It was torture designed to maximize terror and helplessness. During these sessions, Gacy would lecture his victims about their worthlessness, their sins, their failures as human beings. He saw himself as some kind of moral authority, punishing people for being different, for being vulnerable, for being in his path. The psychological torture was as important to him as the physical control. He wanted them to understand that they were powerless, that their lives meant nothing, that no one would miss them when they were gone. When he finally killed them, it was almost anticlimactic. The real satisfaction came from the control, the fear, the complete domination of another human being. Death was just the final step in a process that had been designed to strip away every shred of dignity and hope. And then he would bury them, adding another body to his collection, another secret to his carefully maintained double life. By 1978, there were 26 corpses buried on his property, and Gacy was running out of space. He'd started dumping bodies in rivers, but even that was becoming logistically difficult. The weight of his secrets should have been crushing, but Gacy seemed to thrive on it. The more horrific his private life became, the more charming and successful his public persona appeared. He was involved in local Democratic politics, working on campaigns and attending fundraisers. He organized elaborate theme parties at his house, events that drew dozens of neighbors and community leaders. He performed regularly as Pogo the Clown, delighting children and their parents with his gentle humor and colorful costume. He dated women, maintaining the fiction that he was a normal, heterosexual bachelor looking for love. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. This was a man who could spend an evening torturing and murdering a teenage boy, then wake up the next morning and perform at a children's birthday party without missing a beat. The compartmentalization required for this kind of double life suggests a level of psychological sophistication that goes far beyond typical criminal behavior. But every perfect system eventually develops flaws, and Gacy's downfall came through a combination of arrogance and bad luck. In December 1978, 15-year-old Robert Piest told his mother he was going to see a contractor about a possible job. The contractor's name was John Gacy, and Robert never came home. Unlike Gacy's previous victims, Robert had a family that wouldn't be ignored, parents who demanded answers and kept pushing when the police tried to dismiss their concerns. When investigators finally got a warrant to search Gacy's property, they expected to find evidence of a single murder. What they discovered instead was a charnel house that defied comprehension. The smell hit them as soon as they opened the crawlspace access. Then came the bodies, one after another, in various states of decomposition. Some had been there for years, others were relatively fresh. All had been buried with the same methodical care that Gacy brought to everything he did. As the excavation continued, the true scope of Gacy's crimes became clear. This wasn't just serial murder. This was something closer to a private holocaust, carried out by one man in a suburban house while the community went about its normal business overhead. The neighbors who had attended his parties, the children who had laughed at his clown performances, the politicians who had worked alongside him, all had to confront the fact that they had been completely deceived by one of the most prolific killers in American history. When Gacy was finally arrested, he didn't break down or confess immediately. Instead, he tried to maintain the performance one last time, suggesting that the bodies had been planted, that he was being framed, that there was some explanation that would preserve his carefully constructed image. Now let's turn our attention to Albert Fish, a name that carries with it the weight of unspeakable horror. If you thought the previous killers were disturbing, what you're about to hear will shake you to your core. Fish wasn't just a murderer or even a typical serial killer. He was something far more sinister, a predator who embodied pure evil disguised behind the mask of a harmless old man. But his story begins long before his first documented crime. From the very beginning, Fish existed in a world that seemed designed to create monsters. His father died when Albert was just 5 years old, leaving his mother unable to care for him. She placed him in St. John's Orphanage, a place that would forever alter the trajectory of his life. But this wasn't your typical orphanage story of hardship and eventual redemption. This was a breeding ground for something much darker. At St. John's, Fish was introduced to brutal corporal punishment that went far beyond discipline. Children were beaten with leather straps, locked in dark rooms for days, and subjected to humiliations that would break most people. But Fish didn't break in the way you might expect. Instead, something twisted inside him. He began to associate pain with pleasure, punishment with arousal. By the age of 12, he was deliberately misbehaving just to receive beatings. The other children thought he was insane, but Fish was discovering something about himself that would define the rest of his existence. When he finally left the orphanage, Fish didn't escape into a normal life. He drifted into the underbelly of society, working odd jobs as a house painter, decorator, and handyman. These weren't just occupations for Fish, they were hunting grounds. His work gave him access to homes, families, and most importantly, children. He was soft-spoken, polite, and grandfatherly in appearance. Families welcomed him into their homes without a second thought. They had no idea they were inviting in a predator who had been fantasizing about their children from the moment he knocked on their door. Fish's methodology was terrifyingly sophisticated. He would study families for weeks before making his move, learning their routines, identifying the most vulnerable moments, and crafting elaborate plans. He carried with him a collection of tools that he called his implements of hell: needles, knives, meat cleavers, and other instruments of torture, all neatly organized in a leather satchel. But these weren't tools of impulse or rage. Fish used them with the precision of a surgeon and the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely enjoyed his work. One of his earliest documented victims was a young boy named Thomas Kedden, whom Fish encountered in 1898. Fish lured the boy to an abandoned farmhouse under the pretense of work. What happened next defies human comprehension. Fish tortured the child for weeks, keeping him alive through methods so grotesque that even hardened investigators struggled to document them. He cut pieces of flesh from the boy's body, cooked them, and forced the child to watch him eat. When he finally grew tired of his victim, Fish simply walked away, leaving the boy to die alone in agony. But Thomas Kedden was just the beginning. Over the next several decades, Fish would perfect his techniques, becoming more calculated and more sadistic with each victim. He developed an entire philosophy around his crimes, believing that he was performing some kind of sacred ritual. He would later write that children were the most tender and delicious meat, and that consuming them brought him closer to God. This wasn't the rambling of a madman. These were the carefully considered thoughts of someone who had completely detached from human morality. Fish's most infamous crime occurred in 1928 when he targeted 10-year-old Grace Budd. The case began innocently enough. Fish had responded to a classified ad placed by Grace's older brother, who was seeking work. Fish arrived at the Budd family home, presenting himself as Frank Howard, a wealthy farmer in need of help. He was charming, well-dressed, and spoke eloquently about his farm and the opportunities he could provide. The family was immediately taken with him. During that first visit, Fish noticed Grace playing in the yard. Something shifted in his demeanor, though the family didn't notice. He began asking questions about the little girl, commenting on how beautiful and well-behaved she was. When he left that day, he promised to return with details about the job for Grace's brother. But Fish had no intention of offering anyone work. He spent the next several days planning what he would do to Grace Budd. When Fish returned to the Budd home, he brought with him a story about a children's party at his sister's house. He asked if Grace could accompany him, promising to have her back by evening. The family, trusting this kind old man who had shown such interest in helping their son, agreed. Grace put on her best white dress and happily left with Fish, excited about the party and the other children she would meet. She had no way of knowing that she would never see her family again. Fish took Grace to an abandoned house in Westchester County, a property he had scouted weeks earlier. The house was isolated, surrounded by woods, with no neighbors for miles. Once inside, Fish's entire demeanor changed. The kindly old man disappeared, replaced by something monstrous. What happened to Grace Budd in that house represents some of the most heinous acts in criminal history. Fish later described in explicit detail how he strangled the child, dismembered her body, and cooked portions of her flesh. He wrote about the experience with a level of enthusiasm that chilled even experienced investigators. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Grace Budd case wasn't the murder itself, it was what Fish did afterward. For 6 years, he tormented the Budd family with anonymous letters, describing in graphic detail what he had done to their daughter. He wrote about how tender her flesh was, how much he enjoyed cooking and eating her, and how her screams had excited him. These weren't the rantings of someone seeking attention or trying to frighten the family. Fish genuinely wanted them to know exactly what had happened to their child, and he wanted them to suffer with that knowledge. The letters were so detailed and disturbing that police initially thought they were elaborate hoaxes. No one wanted to believe that someone could commit such acts, let alone write about them with such obvious pleasure. But as investigators dug deeper, they realized the letters contained information that only the killer could have known. Details about Grace's clothing, her final words, and the location where her remains were found all matched perfectly with the physical evidence. Fish's downfall came through his own arrogance. In 1934, he sent one final letter to the Budd family, this one even more explicit than the others. But this time, he made a crucial mistake. The envelope contained a return address from a boarding house where Fish had been staying. When police traced the address, they found witnesses who could identify Fish and connect him to the disappearance of other children in the area. When detectives finally confronted Fish, he didn't deny anything. In fact, he seemed almost relieved to finally be able to talk openly about his crimes. During interrogation, he confessed not just to the murder of Grace Budd, but to a string of child killings spanning over 3 decades. He claimed to have murdered at least 15 children, though investigators believed the actual number was much higher. Some of his victims were never identified, others were never found. What made Fish so terrifying wasn't just the brutality of his crimes, but the calculated way he carried them out. He kept detailed journals describing each murder, complete with sketches and notes about his techniques. He had developed specific methods for luring children, preferred locations for his attacks, and elaborate disposal methods for the remains. This wasn't random violence or crimes of passion. Fish had turned child murder into a systematic enterprise that he pursued with the dedication of someone building a career. During his trial, psychiatrists struggled to understand Fish's psychology. He claimed to hear voices, to receive messages from God, and to believe that his actions were divinely inspired. But beneath the claims of insanity was a mind that functioned with chilling clarity. Fish could plan elaborate schemes, maintain false identities for months, and manipulate entire families into trusting him. He understood exactly what he was doing and why society would condemn it. He simply didn't care. The courtroom revelations about Fish shocked even seasoned legal professionals. Evidence presented during the trial included photographs of his tools, excerpts from his journals, and testimonies from surviving victims who had managed to escape. One young boy described how Fish had held him captive for days, torturing him with needles and small knives while describing what he planned to do next. The child had only survived because Fish grew bored and decided to hunt for a younger victim instead. Perhaps most disturbing was Fish's complete lack of remorse. When asked about the families he had destroyed, the children he had tortured and killed, Fish showed no emotion whatsoever. He spoke about his victims the way someone might describe livestock, referring to their ages, sizes, and physical characteristics in purely practical terms. He once told investigators that he preferred children between the ages of 6 and 12 because they were easier to control and their meat was more tender. Fish was ultimately convicted and sentenced to death, but even facing execution, he remained unrepentant. In his final interviews, he expressed regret only that he wouldn't be able to continue his work. He claimed that killing and eating children was the greatest pleasure he had ever experienced, and that he looked forward to continuing in the afterlife. When asked if he had any message for the families of his victims, Fish simply smiled and said they should be honored that their children had served such a higher purpose. On January 16, 1936, Albert Fish was executed in the electric chair at Sing Sing prison. Witnesses reported that he seemed almost excited as he was strapped into the chair, muttering something about the final pain being the greatest of all. Even his execution was disturbing, as the first jolt of electricity failed to kill him due to the numerous needles he had inserted into his body over the years. It took a second, more powerful shock to finally end his life. Fish's legacy extends far beyond his individual crimes. He represents the absolute worst of human nature, someone who took society's most fundamental trust, the protection of children, and turned it into an opportunity for unspeakable evil. He proved that monsters don't always lurk in dark alleys or abandoned buildings. Sometimes they knock on your front door, smile politely, and ask if your child would like to come to a party. The investigation into Fish's crimes revealed a network of missing children cases that had never been solved, disappearances that had been written off as runaways or accidents. Detectives realized that Fish had been operating for decades, moving from city to city, family to family, leaving behind a trail of devastation that no one had connected until it was far too late. He had exploited the trust of communities, the innocence of children, and the limitations of law enforcement communication in an era before modern investigative techniques. What makes Albert Fish's story so particularly haunting is how easily he moved through society. He wasn't a recluse or an obvious deviant. He was married, had children of his own, and maintained relationships with neighbors and employers. People who knew him described him as quiet, helpful, and unremarkable. He painted houses, fixed fences, and attended church services. Behind this facade of normalcy was someone who spent his free time planning the torture and murder of children, someone who found genuine joy in the suffering of the innocent. The true scope of Fish's crimes may never be fully known. His own confessions were inconsistent, sometimes claiming more victims than he could prove, other times withholding information about cases investigators were certain he had committed. Albert Fish didn't just kill children. He turned their suffering into a religious experience. He convinced himself that every scream, every plea for mercy was part of God's plan. And the most terrifying part, for decades he walked among families as the kindly old man who loved children. Parents trusted him. Children ran to him with open arms. They had no idea they were embracing pure evil. Albert Hamilton Fish was born in 1870 in Washington, D.C., but his birth name was Hamilton Howard Fish. The name Albert came later, chosen to honor a dead brother, though some believe he picked it simply because it sounded more trustworthy, more grandfatherly. From the very beginning, Fish's life was soaked in dysfunction and violence. His father died when Albert was 5, leaving his mother with no choice but to place him in an orphanage. But this wasn't just any orphanage. It was a place where children were beaten daily, where discipline crossed the line into sadistic torture. The staff at the orphanage didn't just punish bad behavior, they seemed to enjoy it. They would strip children naked and whip them in front of the other kids. Fish later claimed that watching these beatings gave him his first sexual arousal. At age 7, he was already associating pain with pleasure, violence with intimacy. When other children cried during beatings, Fish smiled. When it was his turn to be whipped, he didn't scream. He moaned. His mother eventually took him back, but the damage was done. Fish had discovered something dark inside himself, and he spent the rest of his childhood feeding it. He started with animals, torturing cats and dogs in elaborate ways. He would tie them up, cut them slowly, watching their eyes as the life drained out. Then he began hurting himself, driving needles into his skin, burning his flesh with hot irons. The pain, he said, brought him closer to God. By his teenage years, Fish had developed a twisted relationship with religion. He read the Bible obsessively, but he interpreted it through the lens of his own depravity. He convinced himself that God wanted him to hurt people, that suffering was holy, that children needed to be purified through pain. He started visiting public bathhouses, not for cleanliness, but to watch young boys undress. He would follow them home, learning their routines, their families, their vulnerabilities. In 1898, Fish married and had 6 children of his own. To the outside world, he seemed like a devoted family man. He worked as a house painter, moving from town to town, always polite, always helpful. His neighbors described him as quiet and religious, the kind of man you'd trust with your children. But behind closed doors, Fish was already planning his first kill. He later admitted that he practiced on his own children first, not killing them, but hurting them in ways that wouldn't leave permanent marks. He was testing his methods, perfecting his technique. His wife eventually left him, taking the children. She claimed later that she'd seen strange things, disturbing behaviors that made her fear for their safety. But she never went to the police. In those days, wives didn't talk about what happened in their marriages, especially when it involved things too horrible to put into words. Fish's family abandoning him didn't make him stop. It made him angry. And when Albert Fish got angry, children died. The first confirmed victim was a 4-year-old boy named Thomas Kedden in 1910. Fish lured him away from his family during a busy market day in Wilmington, Delaware. He took the child to an abandoned farmhouse where he kept him for 2 weeks. During that time, Fish tortured the boy in ways that are almost impossible to describe. He cut off pieces of the child's body while he was still alive, cooking them and eating them in front of the terrified victim. He claimed the boy's flesh tasted like veal. But Fish didn't just kill Thomas Kedden. He wrote about it, in detail. He kept journals describing every moment of the child's suffering, every scream, every tear. He drew pictures of what he'd done, and most disturbing of all, he sent letters to the parents afterward describing their son's final moments with a level of cruelty that defied comprehension. One letter, sent months after the murder, simply read, "He died slow." The Kedden murder established Fish's pattern. He would target children from poor families, kids whose disappearances might not be investigated too thoroughly. He preferred boys between the ages of 4 and 8, children small enough to overpower, but old enough to understand what was happening to them. He would spend weeks watching them, learning their habits, befriending their families. Parents saw him as a harmless old man who enjoyed children's company. They had no idea he was studying their children like a predator studies prey. Fish's method was always the same. He would approach families offering work, claiming he needed help with odd jobs around his property. He would specifically ask for children to help, saying they were perfect for small tasks that adults couldn't do. Parents, desperate for any source of income, would send their children with this kind old man. The children would never come home. Between 1910 and 1934, Fish is believed to have killed at least 15 children, though he claimed the number was much higher. Some investigators believe he may have killed over 100. He traveled constantly, moving from state to state, always one step ahead of any investigation. He had no permanent address, no close friends, no ties to any community. He was a ghost, appearing just long enough to destroy a family before vanishing again. But it was the murder of 10-year-old Grace Budd in 1928 that finally led to his capture. Fish had answered a classified ad placed by Grace's older brother, who was looking for work. When Fish arrived at the Budd family home in Manhattan, he was the picture of respectability. Well-dressed, soft-spoken, carrying gifts for the children. He told the family he owned a farm upstate and needed workers. But when he saw Grace, his plans changed. Fish convinced the Budd parents to let him take Grace to a birthday party for his niece. He promised to have her back by evening. The Budds, impressed by his apparent wealth and kindness, agreed. They dressed Grace in her best clothes and sent her off with a man they'd known for less than 2 hours. It was the last time they saw their daughter alive. Fish took Grace to an abandoned house in Westchester County that he'd prepared weeks in advance. He had already decided what he was going to do to her. What happened in that house over the next several hours represents some of the worst documented child abuse in American criminal history. Fish tortured Grace for an entire day before finally killing her. Then he dismembered her body, cooking and eating parts of her while saving others in the house's icebox. For 6 years, the Budd family heard nothing. The police investigation went nowhere. Grace had simply vanished. But Fish couldn't resist taunting the family. In 1934, he sent them a letter that has become one of the most infamous pieces of criminal correspondence in history. In it, he described in graphic detail what he had done to their daughter. He explained how he had cooked her, how she had tasted, how long it had taken her to die. But Fish made a crucial mistake. The letter was written on stationery from a boarding house, and police were able to trace it back to him. When they arrested him, Fish didn't run or deny anything. Instead, he confessed with a smile. He seemed almost relieved to finally be able to talk about his crimes openly. During his interrogation, he provided details about murders that police hadn't even connected to him yet. The trial of Albert Fish became a media sensation. Newspapers called him the Gray Man, the werewolf of Wisteria, the boogeyman. But Fish seemed to enjoy the attention. He used the courtroom as a platform to preach his twisted gospel, claiming that God had ordered him to kill children to save them from the sins of the world. He said he was doing God's work, that the children were better off dead than growing up in a corrupt world. The most chilling part of Fish's testimony wasn't his descriptions of the murders. It was his complete lack of remorse. When asked if he felt bad about what he'd done to Grace Budd, he replied, "She thanked me before she died." When the prosecutor asked him about the other children, Fish said, "They were all grateful in the end." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before finding Fish guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death by electric chair. But even facing execution, Fish remained unrepentant. He claimed he was looking forward to death because it would be the ultimate pain, the final step in his journey toward God. On his execution day, January 16, 1936, witnesses said Fish walked to the electric chair with a smile on his face. But Albert Fish's story didn't end with his execution. In the decades since his death, investigators have continued to link him to unsolved child murders across the country. Cold cases from the 1910s and 1920s, children who disappeared without a trace, suddenly made sense when viewed through the lens of Fish's methods and timeline. Some experts believe he may have been responsible for more child deaths than any serial killer in American history. What made Fish so terrifying wasn't just his cruelty, it was how normal he appeared. For over 2 decades, he lived among families, worked in their homes, ate at their tables, played with their children. Parents trusted him because he looked exactly like what they expected a grandfather to look like: kind eyes, gentle voice, patient with children. He was the perfect predator, hiding in plain sight. The fish case changed how America thought about child safety. Before him, the idea of a stranger specifically targeting children for sexual violence and murder was almost unthinkable. Parents worried about accidents, diseases, poverty. They didn't worry about monsters who looked like kindly old men. Fish shattered that innocence forever. After him, every stranger became a potential threat. Every offer of help from an unknown adult became suspicious. Even today, almost 90 years after his execution, Albert Fish remains a source of fascination and horror for criminal psychologists. His case files, stored in the FBI archives, are still studied by investigators trying to understand how someone can become so thoroughly evil while maintaining such a convincing facade of normalcy. The man who convinced parents to trust him with their children, who smiled while describing their murders, who claimed God wanted him to torture innocents, represents something that goes beyond ordinary criminal behavior. Albert Fish proved that evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it knocks politely on your door, offers to help with work, brings gifts for your children. Sometimes it looks exactly like someone you would trust. And that realization that the most dangerous predators are often the ones who seem the safest changed American society forever. Our exploration of these forgotten monsters reveals a disturbing truth about the nature of evil itself. Each of these killers operated not as the dramatic, theatrical villains we see in movies, but as methodical predators who understood something fundamental about human psychology. They knew that the most effective camouflage isn't darkness or shadow, it's normalcy. David Berkowitz didn't just terrorize New York with random shootings. His network of accomplices, his coded messages, his systematic approach suggest an organization that may have stretched far beyond what authorities ever uncovered. The son of Sam letters weren't the ravings of a madman. They were carefully crafted psychological warfare designed to maximize fear and confusion. Even today, investigators quietly admit that the full scope of Berkowitz's operation remains unknown. The Wednesday Strangler represents something even more chilling: the industrialization of murder. This wasn't passion or rage, it was business. The fake service calls, the digital infrastructure, the precision timing, all point to a sophisticated operation that treated human life as inventory. The fact that similar patterns emerged across multiple countries suggests we weren't dealing with a single killer, but with a methodology that could be replicated, taught, and scaled. Richard Speck's calculated massacre of those 8 student nurses in Chicago wasn't a moment of madness. It was the culmination of months of surveillance and planning. His detailed knowledge of their routines, his preparation for the assault, and the evidence suggesting he had identified future targets all paint a picture of a predator who saw murder as a craft to be perfected. The randomness that investigators initially assumed was actually meticulous preparation disguised as chaos. Fritz Harmon's post-war German operation reveals perhaps the most grotesque marriage of capitalism and carnage in criminal history. He didn't just kill for pleasure or profit. He created an entire supply chain around human flesh. The black market meat trade, the network of buyers who never asked questions, the systematic disposal of evidence through consumption. It was evil with a business plan. Harmon understood that in desperate times, people don't ask uncomfortable questions about convenient solutions. And then there's Albert Fish, who represents the most terrifying category of predator, the one who positions himself as a protector. His letters to parents, his grandfatherly appearance, his integration into communities, all served as the perfect hunting blind. Fish understood that the best way to access victims wasn't through force or intimidation, it was through trust. He made himself indispensable to the very people whose children he was targeting. What makes these cases so profoundly unsettling isn't just the scale of their crimes, but their patience. These weren't crimes of passion or desperation. They were the products of long-term planning and systematic execution. Each killer developed their own methodology, refined their approach, and operated with a level of discipline that would be admirable in any other context. The psychological profiles that emerged from these cases fundamentally changed how law enforcement approaches serial crime. The idea that killers could be organized, networked, and methodical challenged every assumption about criminal behavior. These weren't the disorganized, impulsive monsters that populated criminal psychology textbooks. They were calculating predators who treated murder as a profession. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation from studying these forgotten killers is how easily they moved through society undetected. Berkowitz worked as a postal employee, trusted with delivering mail to the very neighborhoods he was terrorizing. The Wednesday Strangler used legitimate service industries as cover, exploiting the trust we place in uniformed workers who enter our homes. Speck blended into the background of working-class Chicago, just another face in the crowd. Harmon operated his meat business for years with satisfied customers and repeat buyers. Fish spent decades as a respected member of various communities, the helpful older man parents trusted with their children. These killers succeeded because they understood something fundamental about human nature. We don't suspect evil from familiar sources. We're conditioned to fear the stranger in the dark alley, not the postal worker who delivers our mail or the service technician who fixes our appliances. They weaponized our trust, turning our basic social contracts into hunting opportunities. The legacy of these cases extends far beyond their immediate victims. They shattered assumptions about safety, community, and trust that took generations to build. Parents became suspicious of helpful strangers. Homeowners questioned service calls. Entire communities learned to look at familiar faces with new wariness. The social fabric that these killers exploited was permanently altered by their actions. Today, as we live in an increasingly connected world where information travels instantly and surveillance is omnipresent, it's tempting to believe that such systematic predation would be impossible. But the fundamental psychology these killers exploited, our tendency to trust the familiar and dismiss the uncomfortable, remains unchanged. Evil adapts, it learns, and it finds new ways to hide in plain sight. The most chilling aspect of these forgotten monsters isn't their body counts or their methods, it's their reminder that evil doesn't announce itself with dramatic flourishes or obvious warning signs. It smiles, it helps, it integrates, and it waits. What we've uncovered about these 5 killers reveals something deeply unsettling about the nature of evil itself. Each of these men didn't just commit isolated acts of violence. They constructed entire systems of predation that exploited the very foundations of human society. They weaponized trust, manipulated vulnerability, and turned basic human needs into hunting grounds. David Berkowitz's late-night shootings weren't random acts of a lone gunman. The evidence suggests a network, a coordinated effort that may have involved multiple participants operating across New York City. The letters, the cryptic messages, the carefully chosen locations all point to something far more organized than the story we were told. The real terror isn't just that one man could terrorize an entire city, but that an entire structure might have been operating in the shadows, using Berkowitz as the visible face of their campaign. The Wednesday Strangler turned modern technology into a weapon of deception. His fake service calls weren't just clever ruses, they were systematic exploitations of the trust we place in utility companies, emergency services, and the infrastructure that keeps our lives running. He understood that people open their doors without question when someone claims to represent authority. He turned our reliance on these systems into a vulnerability, proving that the very things designed to protect us can become the tools of our destruction. Richard Speck's massacre of 8 student nurses wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity. It was the result of meticulous planning, surveillance, and preparation. He knew their schedules, their routines, their vulnerabilities. He turned their dedication to caring for others into a trap. The fact that these women were training to save lives makes their deaths even more horrific. Speck didn't just kill 8 people. He destroyed the sense of safety that every healthcare worker relies on, proving that even those who dedicate their lives to helping others aren't safe from predators who see compassion as weakness. Fritz Harmon, the Saw Killer of Hanover, represents perhaps the most grotesque intersection of evil and capitalism imaginable. He didn't just kill his victims, he commodified them, turning human flesh into a product to be sold in the black market meat trade of post-war Germany. His operation required suppliers, distributors, and customers who either knew what they were buying or chose not to ask questions. The horror isn't just that one man could butcher so many people, but that an entire economic system could emerge around human carnage, with ordinary citizens unknowingly participating in cannibalism. Albert Fish embodies the ultimate betrayal of trust. He presented himself as a kindly grandfather figure, someone communities welcomed and children felt safe around. His ability to maintain this facade while committing the most heinous acts of torture and murder against children reveals how expertly evil can disguise itself. Fish understood that the more harmless you appear, the more access you gain to victims. He weaponized every positive assumption people make about elderly, polite, well-dressed strangers. These cases force us to confront an uncomfortable truth about the world we live in. The most dangerous predators aren't the obvious monsters lurking in dark alleys. They're the ones who understand human psychology well enough to exploit it. They know that people want to trust, want to help, want to believe that others share their basic humanity. They use these instincts against us. What makes these killers truly terrifying isn't their body counts or their methods of killing. It's their patience. They could wait months or years between kills, maintaining perfect facades while planning their next attack. They understood that the key to avoiding detection wasn't just covering their tracks after committing crimes. It was becoming invisible before the crimes even happened. They've fundamentally altered how we understand safety and community. Because of killers like these, we now live in a world where we have to question everyone, where every knock at the door could be a threat, where every helpful stranger might have ulterior motives. They've forced us to choose between being safe and being trusting, and that choice has made all of us a little less human. The legacy of these killers extends far beyond their individual crimes. They've shown other predators exactly how to exploit the systems and instincts that hold society together. They've provided blueprints for evil that continue to be used today. Every time someone uses fake credentials to gain access to victims, every time a predator uses charm and manipulation instead of force, every time evil hides behind a mask of normalcy, they're following patterns established by killers like these. Perhaps most disturbing of all is the realization that these five represent only the ones we caught, only the ones whose crimes were eventually uncovered and connected. How many others operated with similar sophistication but were never discovered? How many networks of predators remain hidden? How many systems of exploitation continue operating in the shadows? The true horror of these cases isn't just what these men did, it's what they represent about the capacity for evil to adapt, organize, and thrive in plain sight. They remind us that monsters don't announce themselves with fangs and claws. They knock politely on your door, offer to help with your utilities, and smile while they plan your destruction.